When the man who had never spent a single night maintaining our systems called me an ancient relic in front of 20 senior executives, I did not scream, throw my coffee, or shed a single tear. Instead, I calmly packed my leather briefcase, gathered my printed reports, and walked out of the glass boardroom while the silence in the room stretched so tight it felt like it would snap. My name is Eleanor, and at 53 years old, I had spent 16 dedicated years building the operational architecture of Apex Consulting from the ground up. I knew every line of custom code, every high-value client requirement, and every hidden weakness in our data infrastructure like the palm of my own hand. In an industry obsessed with flashy buzzwords and youthful posturing, I was the quiet anchor everyone relied on when critical deadlines collapsed. The trouble began when our chief executive took an unexpected business trip to Chicago and left his son, Julian, in charge of our annual strategy alignment session. Julian was a 27-year-old recent MBA graduate who carried himself with unbearable arrogance, constantly wearing tailored suits and throwing around corporate jargon about disruption. He viewed my years of practical experience not as a priceless asset, but as an outdated obstacle that belonged in a museum. During the presentation, as I calmly outlined our projected cost savings and multi-year data integration roadmap, Julian cut me off with a dismissive wave of his hand. He looked around the long conference table, met the uncomfortable eyes of my colleagues, and asked why an old woman was still allowed to occupy space in a progressive company. Before anyone could process the shock of his words, he loudly declared that my services were no longer needed. I walked out into the cool afternoon air with a strange sense of detachment, knowing full well that Julian had no idea what he had just set in motion. Over the weekend, I ignored every incoming call, refusing to indulge in frantic text messages from colleagues who were horrified by the public humiliation. I sat quietly in my garden, enjoying the peaceful silence and letting the corporate chaos simmer without my intervention. By Monday morning, the reality of my absence hit the firm like a freight train, causing internal system errors to pile up almost immediately. The founder returned from Chicago and immediately summoned Julian into his private office after learning about the incident from our head of human resources. When the executive realized that my departure jeopardized our largest annual contracts, he ordered his son to track me down and deliver a personal apology. Later that evening, I pulled into my driveway to find Julian pacing nervously near my front gate, with his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. When I stepped out of my vehicle, he attempted to deliver a canned speech, but the moment I refused to entertain his fake remorse, his fragile ego completely fractured right on my sidewalk. He began shouting that he stood by his decision and that my traditional methods were dragging the firm down. Standing under the warm glow of my porch light, I looked him dead in the eye and reminded him that every major account paying his inflated salary was secured through my hard work. I told him that his arrogance was merely masking his deep incompetence and that he was nothing more than a spoiled child coasting on his father's achievements. He stood there paralyzed by the sharp truth, unable to utter a single coherent reply as I walked inside. What Julian failed to realize was that my home security camera had recorded every second of his loud tirade, complete with crystal-clear visual evidence and sharp audio. When the CEO sent me a desperate email asking me to show grace and return to my post for the sake of the company, I did not type out a long, emotional response. I simply attached the raw video file from my porch camera and pressed send. The impact of that video clip inside the executive suite was immediate, devastating, and entirely undeniable for everyone involved in the leadership hierarchy. Within 2 hours of watching his son scream insults at a veteran employee, the CEO stripped Julian of his unearned title and had security escort him out of the building with his personal belongings packed in a small cardboard box. The entire narrative of my so-called retirement dissolved instantly. The following morning, the founder drove to my house himself, standing on my front doorstep with a posture stripped entirely of his usual corporate pride. He admitted his complete failure to protect the person who built his company, acknowledging that no amount of money could fix the disrespect I had endured. He handed me a formal offer letter that granted me complete operational authority as the new chief operating officer. I accepted the executive role strictly on my own terms, promising that the firm would no longer tolerate entitlement, incompetence, or toxic disrespect under my leadership. On Monday morning, I walked back through those double glass doors, stepping into the top boardroom not as a subordinate defending her value, but as the leader taking her rightful seat at the head of the table. This experience taught me that true authority does not come from loud voices, flashy titles, or privileged connections, but from unshakable merit and self-respect. When you build the foundation, never let someone who merely walked through the front door convince you that you do not belong inside. True dignity is knowing your worth, holding your ground, and letting time expose those who mistake quiet competence for weakness.